Did you know that most things that are considered feminine today were once masculine? Even high heels, cosmetics, and believe it or not, sanitary pads were originally created for men. We are used to thinking that red heels are a symbol of seduction, not victory. That makeup is women's self-care, not a sign of power. That a handbag is a lady's accessory, not the successor to a man's wallet with a knife and coins. But history has a strange sense of humor. Because almost every feminine thing we see in advertisements today was once a weapon, status symbol, or sign of privilege for men. Horsemen once wore heels to stand confidently in the stirrups. Priests once painted their eyes to be closer to the gods. Bags used to be decorated with fangs, not logos. Today, all of this is considered feminine. Back then, it was power. And perhaps the most interesting thing about this story is not how things have changed, but how the world has changed, forcing us to see symbols of power as standards of beauty. So, if you think that heels, cosmetics, or razors are just about appearance, get ready. Next up is a series of stories that will change the way you look at your favorite things forever. Let's start with the first discovery: heels. An item that is now associated with femininity was born on the battlefield. We are used to thinking that heels are about elegance, seduction, red soles, and fashion shows. But once upon a time, they meant something completely different: power, status, and war. 16th century. Persia. Imagine horsemen in heavy leather boots stomping along a stone road. Their heels are raised so that their feet stay firmly in the stirrups. This is not fashion, it is a survival strategy. Heels were not created for balls, but for battle. When Persian horsemen arrived in Europe, this style caught on faster than any new religion. Because it had one important feature: it looked powerful. The higher the heel, the higher the status. And soon the French aristocrats realized that this was not just a detail of footwear, but a social code. Louis XIV, the Sun King, turned it into a cult. His heels were so high that he could barely walk, but that didn't matter. They didn't just stand on them, they ruled with them. Red heels were not about love. They were a form of royal despotism. And only the chosen few had the right to wear red heels. It was not the color of temptation, it was the color of power. At that time, women looked at this attribute with admiration. And later they borrowed it. Not for convenience, but to look closer to power. The paradox is simple and harsh. What today symbolizes femininity once meant military power. Heels were once worn to fight. Today, they are worn to survive a date. The next part is even more paradoxical. Because if heels were a symbol of strength, then cosmetics were a mask of power. If you imagine that makeup was first invented for beauty, you are underestimating the human lust for power. Before it became women's self-care, it was a weapon of influence. Imagine ancient Egypt. A temple in Thebes. A priest with lined eyes, skin glistening with oils, green pigment on his eyelids. This is not fashion, it is ritual. The darker the line, the closer you are to the gods. The priest painted himself not to seduce, but to frighten, to show that he was not a human being, but a mediator between the world and eternity. It was similar in China and Japan. Warriors and officials wore paint on their faces as a sign of discipline. In China, red pigment symbolized rank and discipline, but not all warriors wore it, rather, ritual or theatrical characters who represented the ideal of strength. The color became a sign of power and honor, not a means of attractiveness. The red lips of a samurai before battle were not about beauty, but about controlling fear. The color had power, not attractiveness. And Europe was not far behind. Cardinals, kings, courtiers, everyone wore makeup. In the 17th century, a face covered with white powder said one thing: I am above labor, above the sun, above the crowd. Cosmetics were a universal language of prestige. And then came the Victorian era. Queen Victoria declared makeup a disgrace, the privilege of actresses and sinners. And the world agreed. What priests and kings wore suddenly became a feminine weakness. That's how easily history rewrites roles. The paint that once symbolized power became a symbol of submission. And when we paint our faces today to look confident, we are actually repeating an ancient ritual, just with a different meaning. Once upon a time, makeup frightened enemies. Now it calms society. Everything you know about feminine hygiene today began in war. And no, not women's war. 1914. World War I. Trenches, mud, blood, nurses trying to stop the flow of wounded soldiers. Then Kimberly-Clark created a new material, lightweight, sterile, and extremely absorbent. It was called Celicotton. Its purpose was simple: to bandage soldiers' wounds. And it was the nurses who first noticed that this material was perfect for another task. It absorbed blood much better than anything they had. When the war ended and there were still stocks of Celicotton left, the company simply changed the label. That's how Kotex was born. Pads created for wounded men became a product for women. No one was surprised by the irony. In a society where women's bodies were not discussed openly, the most intimate item for women came about because of a bloody war. And now, advertisements promise comfort and freshness, but rarely mention that behind this is a military invention created to save lives. A means of stopping blood turned into a commodity that taught women to be silent about their blood. And if you think about it, it's an amazing metaphor. Even feminine hygiene was born on the battlefield of men. And even where there should have been care for the body, history began again with a wound. We are used to the idea that heroes are born in war. But sometimes war gives birth to a handbag. Next is an equally paradoxical story. What we now perceive as a female accessory was once a symbol of power, wealth, and danger. Today, we see a bag and think about fashion, brands, and shows. But once upon a time, a bag was not an accessory, but a statement of power. And only men carried it. Ancient times. When there were no pockets, every warrior or traveler carried a leather pouch. It contained coins, a knife, amulets, and perhaps a small talisman to ward off evil spirits. The bag was an extension of the belt, and a part of honor. Archaeologists found the oldest known bag in Germany. It is over 4,000 years old. It is decorated with dog teeth. Not for beauty, but to demonstrate status. The more teeth, the more victories. It was a trophy, like a jewel today. Imagine the first bag, decorated with the teeth of killed animals, and the last, with the Louis Vuitton logo. 4,000 years between trophy and status. In the Middle Ages, bags remained a male attribute. They were hung on the belt along with a dagger or keys. All of this was a sign that you were a wealthy, armed man with something to lose. Women did not need bags at that time. Their clothes had deep folds and ties, and servants carried everything in palaces. The situation changed only in the 18th century. Fashion made women's dresses thinner, and pockets disappeared. And then women had to borrow from men what they considered part of their image of strength. This is how the women's handbag was born, not as an accessory, but as a necessity to survive without pockets. And here's the paradox. What once meant luxury, freedom, and masculinity has become a symbol of women's trinkets. An item that once held knives now carries lipstick. And perhaps somewhere between these two images lies the whole story of how women were forced to adapt to a world created by men. The next story is even more cynical. Because where there should have been an instrument of power, a standard of beauty was born. No object has a more ironic history than the razor. What is presented today as a female standard of cleanliness began as a male instrument of power. Razors existed as far back as ancient Egypt, bronze, heavy, dangerous. Warriors shaved their heads before battles so that the enemy could not grab them by the hair. Roman legionnaires shaved their beards to look disciplined. Greek philosophers, on the contrary, grew beards because they could afford not to fight. Hair was about status. About power over one's own body. Everything changed in the 20th century. In 1901, Gillette launched the first safety razor. The product was created for men, military personnel, businessmen, true gentlemen. And everything worked well, until the market became oversaturated. Men had already bought their razors. And then an idea came along that changed the world. If it's hard to sell razors to men, why not convince women that they need to shave too? 1915. Gillette launches a new line, the Milady Décolleté razor. The ad shows a woman in a sleeveless dress. The caption under the photo reads, "A modern woman should not have unwanted hair." And that's it. From that moment on, naturalness became a problem, and the razor became its solution. Until 1915, women did not shave their legs or armpits. After 1915, it became the norm. And not because women wanted it that way, but because marketing wanted it that way. Female smoothness is not a tradition, but a campaign. Calculated, planned, profitable. And here's the paradox: an item created for the army has become a standard of beauty. Shaving became not a ritual of strength, but a ritual of shame. Beauty was not invented by women, it was invented by brands. Further on, the story becomes even more unexpected. What we consider a symbol of sexuality today was once an attribute of knights and kings. Today, stockings are about seduction, femininity, and smoothness. But once upon a time, they were a symbol of strength, wealth, and combat readiness. Yes, combat readiness. The Middle Ages. Before you stands a knight. Under heavy armor, he wears silk or wool stockings, tightly stretched to the knees. Not for beauty, for convenience. They kept him warm, protected him from chafing, and allowed him to move faster in battle. Aristocrats wore stockings even without armor, as a symbol of status. The thinner the fabric, the richer the owner. Kings ordered silk stockings embroidered with gold thread. At court balls, men showed off their legs rather than their muscles. This was because legs were considered an indicator of strength, endurance, and nobility. In the 16th century, this was the norm. Men wore stockings, women wore long dresses. Imagine Henry VIII posing for an artist in shiny silk stockings. No shame, just power, masculinity, and a display of physical form. It was only in the 18th century that everything changed. Fashion made men's clothing more austere and practical. Stockings were passed down to women as decoration, not as a weapon. And gradually, what once emphasized the strength of the legs became a hint of their submissiveness. What covers today once exposed. And perhaps this is the essence of our culture. A way to hide history under a layer of fabric. If you look at these things side by side, heels, bags, stockings, razors, cosmetics, you might think they have nothing in common. But they are united by something invisible. Power. Each of these items was born not from a desire to look more beautiful, but from a desire to control the body, status, impression. And every time power passed from one hand to another, the meaning of things changed along with it. What once signified power became decoration. What was once a symbol of action became a sign of appearance. Society simply changed the labels, and no one noticed that beneath the glitz, the old structure remained. The body as a territory to be controlled. The history of beauty is not a story about the mirror. It is a story about who stands behind it. Because standards never arise on their own, someone always creates them, someone sells them, someone maintains them. Once upon a time, red heels meant that you could give orders. Today, they mean that you have to be liked. But history has a habit of repeating itself. And perhaps the next generation will once again turn beauty into a weapon. When we talk about femininity, we rarely mention the history of power. But perhaps all this is just the evolution of weapons. Because true beauty has never been about submission, it has always been about survival. Beauty does not always mean submission. Sometimes it is the only language with which to respond to the system.